The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $40, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Amos Pruett did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought, a life-size carved wooden figure standing among the furniture at the end of the row. A 6-foot tobacconist shop figure of a kilted Highlander in a plumed bonnet, one carved arm held out with a snuff mull in the hand, the whole of it up on a heavy cast iron base and split down one shoulder with age and gone dull and shapeless under coat after coat of caked house paint, so overpainted that the fine carving under it read to the crowd as nothing but a worm-eaten old shop dummy. A figure the whole county had already written off as a worthless gimmick nobody would want cluttering a porch, that 100 bidders had walked past and waved off, and that Amos had just paid $40 to own, split shoulder and dead paint and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel lot at the end of summer. At a county estate auction held in the grassy yard beside a weathered gray barn on the edge of a small river town. Amos was 71 years old, broad through the shoulders and steady on his feet even now, with a deeply lined face gone sun-brown and weathered, short iron gray hair under a flat wool cap, gray stubble, and pale, steady eyes that did not move fast. His hands were broad and sure and marked with old paint and old cuts, the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime shaping wood and laying gold and reading the grain other men only ever painted over. Amos had worked at trade his whole life, a sign painter, gilder and carver's man, the one they sent for when a thing had to be lettered true or carved clean or gilded to last, until the shops went to printed plastic and vinyl, and the old men who could cut a letter or a face by hand were quietly let go. The man who laughed was Roy Deller, who ran the biggest antiques-and-salvage business in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud crimson plaid work jacket he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy. A thick gold ring on one hand and a cigar in the other. $40, Roy said, loud so the whole lot could hear it. $40 for a painted-up wooden Scotchman old-timer. Look at the state of the thing. Shoulder split, face gone under a half-inch of porch paint, worm holes up the back, and so old and ugly the family stood it out by the barn so they wouldn't have to look at it. Nobody's wanted one of these hardware store dummies since before the war, and nobody's going to. You can't sell it, you can't give it away, and it's too big to hide in a shed. You didn't buy an antique, you bought 6 feet of painted-over firewood, and you paid $40 for the privilege of hauling it home. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the Wooden Scotchman, and it stuck for the rest of that month. The crowd laughed because Roy laughed, the way a crowd does. Amos stood through it without a change in his face, his thumbs hooked in his apron strings, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something made and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Amos's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Amos said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What none of them knew, what Roy Deller could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Amos had stood in front of that painted figure with more than 50 years awake in him, and something older besides. The crowd saw a worm-eaten dummy. Amos saw the carving. He saw, under the dead paint, the way the bonnet swept and the plaid broke over the carved knee, the way the outstretched arm was cut so the wrist turned just so, the modeling of the cheek and the brow where the overpaint had chipped thin. And the carving was wrong for what they were all saying. He had cut figures like it. He knew what a hack's work looked like. Blunt and dead and even. And he knew what a master's looked like, alive under your hand before you ever cleaned it. This was a master's. He had, as a young man, apprenticed under a ship's carver who cut figureheads for the last of the sailing trade, and then in a carousel-and-figure shop, and he knew how a proud carver worked, and above all, that a carver that good almost always cut his own name into his work somewhere, under the base, behind the heel, where the shop paint would later bury it. The rest of them were pricing the thing by how ugly the paint was. Amos knew the difference between a dummy and a masterwork somebody had painted over, and what Amos found when he cleaned that figure down that night would cut a forgotten man's name back into the history that had let it go. Amos had come up hard. He went to the carver's bench young, learning the gouge and the mallet and the long, patient feel of following grain until the wood gave up the shape hiding in it, and across the years made himself into the kind of hand at church or a carousel man or a shop front called by name when the work had to be right and had to last. His wife Della had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own. And after Della was gone, he lived alone in a small house behind his old paint shop with his tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hands and no use at all for his memory. He knew that. He bid on the figure anyway. He bid because he knew it. A master's carving buried under a fool's paint is a question, and a man who had cut 1,000 true figures could no more walk past a great one going for firewood than walk past his own past. The crowd had seen a painted dummy. Amos had seen the figure as it was. The face modeled by a proud hand, the folds cut clean and living. The whole of it made by somebody who knew exactly what he was doing and had signed it where a proud carver signs. If you've made it this far into Amos's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first. The implements and the furniture and the boxed lots knocked down to the dealers, while Amos waited at the end of the row beside the tall carved figure. When the auctioneer finally came to the wooden Highlander and called for a bid, Roy glanced at it, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Amos raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 40. He paid in cash at the table, signed the slip, and arranged to bring his truck and a couple of moving blankets around at the end of the day, because a 6-foot figure on an iron base was an awkward, heavy thing for one man, and the auction rules gave a man until dark to haul off what he had bought. The story got around the town before Amos's truck was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, whether he was going to stand his wooden Scotchman out front to scare the birds. Ed Marsh, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer than the rest, that there was nothing to an old shop figure but ugly paint and wormholes and a family too polite to burn it. Amos was buying a bottle of paint remover and a box of fine steel wool and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that carving is either a master's or it isn't. And the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which one. But Amos did not clean the figure down in the daylight. With the dealer's truck still on the lot and Roy holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out and he had the tall figure home, eased down off the truck, and stood square on his shop floor under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night. After the town had gone quiet and the windows up the street had gone dark. The overpaint was thick and dead and layered on for years, and rather than gouge at it and scar the carving under it, he worked it slow, brushed on the remover a panel at a time, let it lift the old coat soft, and eased the paint away with steel wool and a wooden scraper and a rag. Careful as lifting varnish off a good painting, reading the modeling as it came clean out of the muck. And when the first face of it came up out of the dead paint under his lamp, the cheek, the carved brow, the living turn of the mouth, he stopped with a rag in his hand. Because what came up was not a hardware dummy's blunt face, but a portrait carved by a real hand, and it looked back at him out of 100 years of paint like something that had been waiting for exactly this. Down at the diner they were still asking if he had stood his Scotchman out to scare the crows. Amos wiped his hands and moved the lamp lower, down toward the heavy iron base, the way you turn a canvas to find the corner where a painter signs. The figure had its own long, sad history, and the town had let it go for firewood with never once asking after it. It ran all the way back to the man who had carved it, a gifted immigrant woodcarver who, generations before, had crossed the water young and cut figureheads for the last of the great sailing ships, prows and stern boards, and the tall carved women that rowed the bows out of the harbor worked good enough that captains asked for him by name. And when the sailing trade died and the iron steamers wanted no figureheads, he had turned his gouge to what work was left, the carved figures that stood outside the tobacco and cigar shops, Highlanders and sea captains and grand carved gentlemen, cut with the same master's hand that had once ridden the bows of ships. He had carved beautifully and been paid poorly, and when that trade died, too, cheapened and then forgotten, he had died poor and unremembered in a rented room, his name kept nowhere, his life's work scattered to porches and junk piles and painted over until not one soul remembered a master had made any of it. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of an artist when the world stops wanting the only thing his hands could do. The answer had been standing at the end of the row the whole time, buried under house paint in a $40 figure nobody wanted. Amos worked the remover down over the heavy cast iron base and eased the last dead paint off the flat of it, and what the steel wool brought up under the lamp told him whose figure it was before he had fully cleared it. Cut into the flat of the iron base, filled and hidden by a century of overpaint, was lettering, not stamped, not cast, but carved, incised by a proud hand into the woodblock set in the base, and struck once more into the iron a name, and beneath it a small carved shop mark, a maker's device the way a master signs a thing he means to stand behind. Amos cleaned it out letter by letter with a pick and a soft brush, breathing shallow, and when the whole of it stood clear in the lamplight, he set the rag down and stood very still. He knew the name. Any man who had come up under the old carvers knew that name. A ship's carver and figure maker, spoken of in the trade, the way painters speak of a master. A hand that everyone in the craft had heard of and almost no one outside it remembered. A maker whose signed work was so scarce it was half legend. And here it stood, cut in the man's own hand into the base of a figure the whole county had priced as firewood. But the signature was only the half of it. Amos went back over the figure inch by inch now, cleaning where the overpaint had hidden the master's hand and behind the carved heel, on the back block where the paint was thickest and no buyer would ever have looked, he found it struck a second time, the same carved mark. A maker who signed twice because he knew what he had made. And under the last of the dead paint, the whole figure came clear at last. Not a blunt shop dummy at all, but a masterwork. The plaid and the bonnet and the outstretched arm cut, with the exact living genius of a man who had once carved the tall women that rode the bows of ships, the face modeled so true it seemed about to speak. Amos stood back from it under the work lamp with the paint-black rag in his hands and understood that the wooden Scotchman had been a signed masterpiece by a great forgotten carver the entire month the town laughed at it, that the object itself, the figure standing whole in his shop, was the treasure, worth a small fortune to a museum or a collector who knew that name, and worth more than money as the last best proof that a great artist had ever lived at all. The next morning Amos did not call a single dealer to sell, and did not strip the figure to bare wood to make it bright, and did not stand it out on his own porch as a curiosity, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $40 for a wooden Scotchman, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the figure's carved name first to a folk art museum that knew what the mark meant, and then to the maritime carving records and the old shop rolls that could trace the master's hand, and set himself to the harder things. To cut a forgotten artist's name back into the history that had dropped it, and to find what descendants the carver had left, and put into their hands the fact that their people had been a master, not a nobody who died in a rented room. The museum's curator went very still over the base and said quietly that a signed figure of that age by that hand, whole and cleaned and certain, was the kind of thing a folk art collection waits a lifetime for and almost never finds, and that the man who cut it, who had carved the bows of ships and then died poor and forgotten when the trade died, was no anonymous hack at all, but one of the finest carvers the country ever quietly threw away. And the carver had descendants in the country still. A great-granddaughter 2 valleys over among them, a gray woman who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old great-grandfather had done some carving before he died with nothing, a story the family half believed and mostly let go. Amos went to her that fall with a photograph of the cleaned figure and the carved name plain in its base, and watched a gray woman read her own great-grandfather's signature cut by his own hand into a masterwork, beside the curator's word that the man had been a master of the craft. She put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up thinking their old carver a poor man who made cigar-store dummies. The cleaned figure told him instead that he had been an artist good enough to hang in a museum, and that the world had simply forgotten to remember him. The woman asked the old carver why he had troubled to come so far to give a dead man back his name. Amos said only that a carver cuts his name into his work so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having been, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, so he had brought the old master's name, and the proof of what his hands could do, home to the people it was always meant for. There was one thing more Amos did before the tall figure left his shop, and he did it for the forgotten carver and for no one else. He cleaned and stabilized the figure the slow, careful way over a week of nights, drew the last dead paint gently off the master's carving, glued and pinned the split shoulder true, and fed the dry old wood until the grain came back, not to make a show of it, but because a masterwork a great hand had made deserved to stand as itself. And he did not strip it down to raw wood and repaint it a bright sharp color and stand it on his porch as a novelty tobacco store figure, because using a master-signed work as a painted lawn gimmick was the most ordinary thing in the world, the very thing that had buried it in the first place, and there was no truth in it. The truth was the carving itself and the name cut in its base and the great forgotten hand it gave back to the world. So on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Amos stood the tall figure square in the middle of his shop under the work lamp, the master's carving clean and the signed base turned to the light, and looked at it a long quiet while, and then switched off the lamp and let it rest. He had not repainted the Scotchman to stand on his porch. That part was never the point. He had cleaned it so that the man who carved it and the genius he died forgotten for would be known one time by somebody who finally understood what he was. That fall the carved figure went where it belonged, into a folk art museum with the master's name read clear at last on the old maritime carving records, and the pride of it and a share of what a signed masterwork like it is worth went to the carver's descendants the mark helped Amos find, generations late, so the family that had thought their old man nobody knew at last that he had been a master. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Amos a fool let the name the wooden Scotchman drop and did not pick it up again. Roy Deller was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look at. And the next time he held court by the auction table, the others did not lean in so far. Amos never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten carver's name and the proof of his life's work back up out of 100 years of dead paint. The museum kept the figure where the town could see it. They set the tall carved Highlander on a low platform behind a rail in the front hall under a soft light. The wood clean and fed and dark again. The split shoulder healed, the outstretched arm and the snuff mull carved sharp once more, the master's name cut clear at last on a plate at its foot, the signed work of a forgotten mastership's carver and figure maker, an immigrant artist who carved the bows of ships and died poor and unremembered, restored to his own name at last, and beside it the carver's own signature photographed from the base where 100 years of paint had hidden it, and a card that told whoever came through that the man who made this figure had been one of the country's great carvers, thrown away and painted over when his trade died, and remembered again only because somebody troubled to clean the thing they laughed at. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Amos Pruett drove over to look in on it, and there in the last of the sun stood the carved figure, whole and cleaned and seen at last, the honey-toned wood glowing where a stranger's hands had finally reached it. Amos was 71 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad paint-marked hand flat on the cool iron base beside the carved name and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A carver cuts his name into his own work and trusts that somebody will come who can read what his hands made under whatever the years lay over it, so that being forgotten for 100 years can never be the same as never having made the thing, and a town rarely knows what genius stood at the end of its own auction row until somebody troubles to clean the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Amos Pruett right to give the figure to a museum under the dead carver's name and put the worth of it into the family's hands without keeping it for himself? Or was that one decency too far, in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.